We've been looking at some really fascinating stuff lately, diving deep into the Torah and all this talk about Psalm 119 and the soul's journey.
Yeah.
It's pretty amazing stuff, like especially how they describe the soul kind of going down into the material world and then, having to like climb its way back up to holiness.
Right. And I think for this deep dive, what we really want to do is get to the core
Yeah.
of what spiritual awakening really means. How does that process of growth actually happen?
Right.
And then the big question is, what role does the Torah play in all of this? Because the text really paints it as a kind of divine blueprint guiding us along this whole journey.
Yeah, it's like the ultimate map. Right.
Exactly. And I think one of the most fascinating parts is how they tie all of this into the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. Each letter becomes like a stage, in the soul's development, starting with that initial seeking and then ending with complete wholeness.
I love that. Okay, so I got to ask,
Yeah.
the author whose work we're looking at clearly has a deep connection to Hebrew tradition.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, you could feel it in their writing. But what really struck me was their insistence on the absolute necessity of divine guidance.
Yes.
Like, we need it. And I love how they use these everyday analogies to make it make sense. Comparing the Torah to a travel map for life.
Yeah.
Saying we're like these super complex machines needing a user manual.
Yeah.
I mean, who hasn't felt like they need a manual for life at some point, right?
Right. And that's exactly what they're getting at, the idea that we're not just these physical beings. We're this amazing blend of body and spirit. And they're saying that if we really follow the teachings in the Torah thoughtfully, we can actually correct what they call misalignments.
Disalignment.
Yeah, like in our soul's operating principles. It's almost like debugging, right? To reconnect with the Creator.
I like that. That's a good way to put it. So this whole thing about needing a divine blueprint, they really hit on something there. I mean, think about it. Would you ever go on a trip without directions, without a map?
Yep.
Exactly. So why would we try to navigate, the complexities of life without some kind of guide, some set of instructions? There's a real logic to it.
Absolutely. And they take that analogy even further. They describe humans as griaries, these really intricate, complex machines.
Right, with all the gears and cogs.
Yeah, exactly. But they have both tangible parts, the physical, and intangible parts, the spiritual. So if our bodies are like the hardware.
And then our soul is like the software.
Okay.
I like where this is going.
Exactly. And the software have code, right? That's how they put it. Our soul has its own operating code, but like any code, it can get, corrupted, almost like a computer virus. And that messes with its ability to, function the way it's supposed to.
Wow, that is powerful imagery. A virus in our soul.
It gets you thinking, doesn't it?
It does. Okay, so this idea that our soul has its own code that needs tending to, it reminds me of, it's not just in Judaism, right? It's in a lot of traditions, like that idea that we're so much more than what we see and touch.
Oh, definitely. And the text even mentions the Tao Te Ching, the concept of yin and yang.
Oh yeah, blood and qi.
Exactly. It's that inseparable connection between the physical and the spiritual. The soul really shapes our choices, aspirations, everything.
It really does.
Another interesting point the author makes is about a scientist who also happened to be a person of faith. And this scientist, he viewed the Bible, he called it the best advice before leaving Earth. Like, it's this manual for understanding this whole system of existence we're part of. It's a different way of looking at it, but it really points to the practical wisdom we find in spiritual texts.
Right, because it's not all about just our own personal well-being, right?
No, definitely not.
Like the text says, the Torah is this all-encompassing guide. It's about everything. Our relationships with each other, how we take care of ourselves, physically and spiritually, and even the health of our communities. It's pretty comprehensive.
It really is. And I think what the author's trying to get across is that true science and real spirituality, or what they call SL. Yeah, they actually support each other. They're not at odds.
I see what they mean.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about the sanctity of the Torah and Psalm 119. The text mentions this hierarchy of holiness in Jewish tradition, right?
Yeah.
With the Torah, the first 5 books of Moses, as the most sacred.
Yes.
And then followed by the Psalms. I found that really interesting.
Me too. And it's clear that the author places a huge emphasis on Psalm 119, saying it offers some of the most profound insights into the mysteries of our hearts and souls. They even express a concern that these meanings often get lost in translation.
Oh, for sure. I mean, anyone who's ever tried to translate poetry or something with very specific cultural references knows how much can get missed.
Yeah, you lose the nuances.
Exactly. The
Yeah.
text mentions how any language loses something in translation, and that's just the nature of it, unfortunately.
It is. And the author really stresses the importance of going back to the Hebrew original, the Sifrei origin, because there's this deep belief in Kabbalistic tradition that God actually used the Hebrew alphabet to create the world.
Whoa, really?
Yeah. So essentially they're saying these letters are like the fundamental code, the operating code of the whole cosmos. They even bring up near-death experiences where people claim to have glimpsed this underlying code.
Like the Matrix.
Haha, kind of. But it's that concept of everything being built on this fundamental code, this language of creation, which makes the author's mission to decipher Psalm 119 even more fascinating because it's the longest psalm. They believe it must have a really crucial message about our spiritual journey because it's so focused on God's laws, the muyi.
Right, it's almost like they're looking for the key to unlocking this whole other dimension of understanding. So, speaking of understanding, let's talk about how these teachings are actually conveyed.
Okay.
The text points out that sometimes the way different Hebrew terms for God's laws get translated in English can lead to some, well, misunderstandings.
Absolutely.
Like, for example, the Hebrew term misvod, which at its core means a way to connect with God, but often gets translated as commandments, which feels a lot more forceful, like a demand.
Exactly. And that subtle difference can really change how we view the whole thing. Misvote gives us this sense of possibility, like a path for connection.
A choice.
Right. Whereas commandments can make us feel like it's all about obligation.
I get it. And there are other terms too, right?
Oh, yeah.
Process, statutes, ordinances, each one represents a different kind of law.
Yeah, they all have their specific meaning.
And some, like the dietary laws, the ones the text refers to as kochi rose, they can seem a bit beyond our human understanding. Like, why is this food okay and this one isn't?
That's true, and those fall into the category of statutes, the chukim.
Yeah.
They don't always have a readily apparent explanation, but following them is an act of faith and obedience, kind of like traffic laws, right? You might not understand the reasoning behind every single rule, but you follow them because they maintain order, keep us safe. And in this case, these statutes are divinely ordained.
Right, like a cosmic traffic system.
Exactly. And then you have what the text calls crisis, or sir, the mishpatim. And those are about moral conduct, things our human reason can grasp a little easier, like honoring our parents, not stealing, those kinds of
Right,
things.
stuff that just seems to make sense.
Exactly.
So all of this really reinforces the author's insistence on going back to the Hebrew root, right?
Oh, absolutely.
To really capture the true meaning, those deeper spiritual lessons embedded in the Torah.
Because even the slightest difference in translation can obscure what was originally intended. It's those nuances that can make all the difference.
For sure. Okay, so one of the most fascinating things we wanted to dig into today is this idea of the spiritual journey being reflected in the Hebrew alphabet, particularly in Psalm 119. So Psalm 119, it's organized into 22 sections, right?
That's right.
And each section starts with a different letter of the Hebrew alphabet, going in order,
Yeah.
kind of like our A to Z.
Right. And the author sees this as a powerful symbol of the soul's journey, its spiritual awakening and growth.
Yeah, it unfolds step by step, starting with Aleph, that initial seeking of spiritual understanding, and then culminating with Tav, reaching a state of holiness filled with gratitude and enthusiasm.
It's a really beautiful progression.
And then they use this perfect analogy, comparing it to a seed sprouting from the earth, slowly growing, and finally bearing fruit. It perfectly captures that organic development, the unfolding of spiritual understanding.
It really does. And this concept isn't unique to Hebrew tradition. They draw a parallel to the I Ching, where you have the transition from Kien, representing heaven, to Kun, representing earth. And it symbolizes that whole journey from birth to death.
Wow, so these really ancient systems of thought were already grappling with these profound questions about life, death, and the spiritual path. It's amazing to see how those themes resonate across different cultures.
It really is. So much wisdom packed into those ancient traditions.
Absolutely. Okay, let's get down to the nitty-gritty, starting with Aleph, the first letter. And the text links Aleph with the very name of the Creator.
Exactly. The letter Aleph is profoundly connected to the divine essence.
And they go on to explain that the word Aleph itself, the way it's pronounced, represents the one who transcends the material world but is also the source of all existence.
It all begins with Aleph.
And then they break down the word Adam, meaning humanity, into Aleph, the Creator's breath, and Dam, blood or flesh. So it's like saying that without that divine essence, all you're left with is the physical. It's a powerful reminder that true human existence is about that connection to the divine.
It's not just about the body, it's about the soul, the breath of God within us.
Right. And then they bring up this Kabbalistic idea of the golem. You know, that being created from clay and brought to life through these special letter combinations.
Yeah, the golem.
But it lacks that divine spark, the breath of Aleph, and therefore it doesn't have true consciousness.
Right.
It made me think of our conversations about AI today. You know, how it can mimic intelligence, but it's missing that essential something, that divine breath, or what the text calls fully logical consciousness.
That's a really interesting connection. And they also bring up the idea from Psalms of God forming the unborn child in the womb, but the spirit entering later.
Right, so the physical form is there, but the soul, that spark of life, arrives later, which ties back to the golem idea, that the physical form alone isn't enough. And it might even relate to that Jewish tradition about the soul entering the embryo around 40 days.
Right, that's a key concept in Jewish thought. So the Aleph section of Psalm 119, it really lays the foundation.
It does.
It's all about seeking and recognizing the Creator as the starting point. It says knowing God means following His ways, His Torah, His Su, and His statutes, His whole, completely wholeheartedly, and turning away from, well, wickedness.
Turning away from that which would lead you astray.
Right, and there's this great analogy they use comparing moral conduct to cleaning the house before you start decorating.
So it's about establishing that ethical foundation first, getting things in order before you start building on top of it.
Exactly. That's step one in spiritual growth, like prepping the ground before you plant a seed. And the Torah is like the architect's blueprint, guide how we build our soul, how we structure it.
That's a beautiful way to put it. So it's not just about seeking God. It's about creating the right environment within ourselves to receive that connection.
Exactly. And the Aleph section goes on to talk about the blessing for those who follow God's witnesses.
Witnesses, what does that mean?
Right. So they clarify that it means God's appointed times.
Oh, okay.
The Sabbath, festivals, things like that, the Pul. These are like special times set aside for us to connect with the Creator, times for spiritual renewal, like a kind of spiritual recharging.
Oh, I like that. Like plugging into a source of spiritual energy.
Exactly.
It's not just about following the rules, it's about actively seeking that connection.
Exactly. And they really hammer home the importance of pursuing the Creator with everything you've got, avoiding iniquity, guarding His laws diligently, even bringing up that teaching that not a single detail of the law will pass away.
Wow, they're not messing around.
No, they're serious about this. And they go on to describe the Torah as a soul's lamp, a light guiding our way through the darkness.
Which contrasts with the state of humanity, that fallen state.
Right, where true wisdom's been lost. And they attribute this to the virus of sin, which ultimately leads to suffering, all being suffer. It's a pretty bleak picture.
It is. But the Torah offers hope, right?
Exactly. It's the prescription for the soul's sickness. But if we reject it, we remain ignorant, unaware of the problem and the cure. And that's why the author keeps coming back to the Torah in Psalm 119, because it holds the key to understanding and correcting that soul's code.
It's like we need the manual to fix the software.
Exactly. So guarding God's orders and laws, they say that's how we avoid repeating Adam and Eve's mistake.
Right, that feeling of shame and separation.
Exactly. By following His misvote, we open ourselves up to that connection, that divine energy.
With a heart that's aligned with righteousness, with the two.
Right. They describe a righteous person, a who, as someone who hates injustice, who chooses to surround themselves with other people who follow God's laws. It's like that story of Menzies' mother moving 3 times to find the best environment for him to thrive.
Yeah, so it's not just about our individual actions, it's also about who we choose to be around, that influence.
Exactly. And this righteous person, they stay true to God's word even when people oppose them, even when a Korean, even when princes sit and condemn me.
Wow, so it's about that unwavering commitment, staying true to your path even when it's hard.
Exactly. And they emphasize the importance of God's appointed times, the chuo, as a vital form of guidance, like a bilatur, a military strategist.
Okay, so that's a lot packed into Aleph.
It is. It lays a lot of groundwork.
It does. Okay, so what about Bet, the second letter?
So Bet, It relates to wisdom and understanding, but it also signifies a house, a house. And they connect this to our physical body as the dwelling place for the soul.
Right.
So the bet section addresses how someone young, representing the soul in its early stages, should approach God's path.
So it's like the soul has just descended into the material world, needing to be repaired to find its way back to the Creator.
Exactly. It's the beginning of the journey, and it stresses seeking God with your whole heart, never straying from his commands, and treasuring his words in your heart. They use this phrase, who, which means like a humanity virus.
A humanity virus, that's interesting.
Right, it's like that tendency to make choices that aren't in alignment with the soul's true purpose. And they're saying that God's words act as protection against that.
Oh, I like that. So God's words become like an antidote to the things that would lead us astray.
Exactly. And there's this prayer for God to personally teach his laws, and for our mouths to be filled with righteous judgments, with a sense of responsibility towards society. It's about aligning our actions with our words, with our beliefs.
So it's not just about personal transformation, but about how that transformation impacts the world around us.
Exactly. And again, they highlight those holy days, the Ruth, but this time they talk about them as sources of spiritual energy for navigating life's challenges. It's like they provide that extra boost we need to keep going, even when we don't fully understand everything.
It's about trusting the process, trusting the rhythm.
Exactly. And they really emphasize valuing obedience to God's rhythms, his Avor, over chasing material wealth. And they talk about meditation, contemplating God's decrees as a way to uncover deeper spiritual wisdom. That's a strong Kabbalistic theme, by the way.
Right, that deep contemplation unlocks those hidden meanings.
Exactly. And that's how a young person, someone new to this path, stays committed by loving God's words, never forgetting them. That's how they follow the Creator's blueprint.
So it's about developing that deep, abiding connection with God's teachings, keeping them close to your heart as you navigate the world.
Exactly. And just briefly, we should touch on Gimel, the third letter.
Okay, what does Gibble represent?
Gimel is associated with giving, kia, and abundance.
Okay.
And the theme in the Gimel section of Psalm 119 is about asking God for what we need in life.
Makes sense.
But the emphasis is on upholding his word, not just fulfilling our own desires. And there's this beautiful image of our eyes being open to see the wonders of the Torah.
To really appreciate it, to see it with new eyes.
Right. And there's this realization that we're just passing through this world, just sojourners. So we shouldn't hide God's laws, we should share them. And they talk about learning the meaning of his laws through life's tough times. How hardship can illuminate things for us.
Right, we learn so much through those difficult experiences.
Exactly. And God, he rebukes the proud, those who ignore his laws. The righteous, they separate themselves from evil and seek out the holy.
So it's about humility, recognizing our need for guidance, and choosing to surround ourselves with that which is good.
Exactly.
Okay, so we can't possibly go through all 22 letters today, but I'm really curious, could you just briefly touch on some of the themes for the other letters, just to give us a sense of the whole journey?
Oh, sure. So Dalet is about humility, realizing we're not self-sufficient.
Makes sense.
Him represents God's grace and the breath of life itself. Vav signifies connection, the act of joining together. Zain is interesting. It's about spiritual warfare. That inner struggle between good and evil.
The struggles we face within ourselves.
Exactly. And the nourishment we need to overcome those battles. Chet is about the essence of life itself. Tet is about inherent goodness. Yod signifies a deep intimacy with God, a close relationship. Kaf is all about the material world and how we can use it for spiritual transformation. Lamed represents learning and that upward climb on the spiritual ladder.
Wow, it's really comprehensive, each letter adding another layer of meaning.
It really is. Mem is about water and purification, the cleansing of the soul. Nun represents faith and that continuity across generations. Samek is about God's support and protection. Ayin is about spiritual vision, seeing things with a clearer perspective. Pet is all about the power of the spoken word, divine utterance. Sad is about righteousness and justice. Quof signifies elevation, rising higher spiritually. Resh is about the head, about deep contemplation, spiritual depth. Shin represents God's name and the fire of divine presence. And finally, Tav, the end of the journey, that state of completion, filled with gratitude and pure joy.
It's an incredible roadmap for spiritual growth.
It really is.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, it's clear that the Torah offers this incredibly rich and detailed guide for the soul's journey, taking us from that initial descent into the material world and leading us back to wholeness, back to that connection with the Creator. We talked about the significance of the Hebrew language, the deep wisdom embedded in Psalm 119, and that beautiful, poetic way the Hebrew alphabet mirrors the steps of spiritual growth. It's pretty amazing stuff.
It really is. And I think it's important to remember what we were talking about earlier, that following the Torah, as the author describes it, it's not about being restricted by rules. It's about embracing a path that leads to true wisdom, real inner freedom, and that connection to the source of everything. It's about fixing that code in our souls and living a life filled with purpose, finding peace and joy in loving God and obeying his laws like a lost sheep finally finding its way home.
That's a beautiful image. You know, this whole conversation, it really makes you think. So for you listening, consider this: what if our lives are actually a spiritual journey, this constant process of rediscovering who we really are? What if ancient wisdom, like what we find in the Torah and Psalm 119, actually holds the keys to navigating our modern world? Maybe take some time to reflect on where you are on this journey, on this spiritual alphabet, and what user manual you're following in your own life. It's certainly a lot to ponder.